Hello everyone, my name is Marcos Colon and I'm the Digital Content Coordinator at SC Magazine. Welcome to today's webcast sponsored by Spector on detecting the enemy within, getting more out of DLP. Our presenters today are Alan Schimmel, co-founder and managing partner of the CISO Group, where he focuses on security consulting and PCI compliance management for the payment industry, and Nick Cavalancia, VP of Marketing for Spector, where he assists in driving innovation and evangelism of Spector solutions. Each of these gentlemen have years of experience in the industry, and today they'll be sharing some of their insight with us. It's no secret that data is the crown jewel of any organization, and in order to ensure its safety, the proper security measures must be in place. With so many trusted insiders at any given organization, security practitioners must keep in mind that they not only have access to that sensitive data, but also the means to which move it around, which also creates a risky scenario. Although DLP solutions provide a security barrier, intent insiders can find a way around. This webcast will cover what you should and shouldn't expect from your DLP solution, the reality of detecting breaches, and 6 security holes you aren't really addressing. With that being said, now I'd like to welcome Nick. Nick, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. So I think we've already gone through the about the speakers, so I think we can maybe go past that a little bit. But Alan, I'm joined by Alan Schimmel today. Alan, I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure to be here as always, and looking forward to a great webinar.
Yeah, that should be. I think it will be a good time here. So let me quickly tell you just a little bit about Spector for those of you that are not familiar with us. We've been around 14, 15 years or so. We have a little over 100 employees. We are headquartered here in Florida. I'm in our West Palm Beach office, where it's mostly just sunny with a little bit of scattered clouds here, so that's nice. We are privately held. We do have almost 1 million home customers and about 36,000 business customers, and have been an 8-time Inc. 500 and 5,000 winner. We've recently run a number of awards. The most recent one is for a finalist for the best small-medium enterprise security solution, finalist for SC Magazine in the U.S. So we're kind of proud of that. And everyone's already got an award slide. Usually when they do their presentations, we're no exception. In the same fashion, every vendor has a customer slide, so we're going to put one up too. But more importantly, I don't want you to focus necessarily on the customers that are listed here. I think what's more important here is the wide variety of industry verticals that are represented. Our solutions that seek to monitor what employees do and what systems are doing on a daily basis is important in any industry vertical. So let's kind of jump into the agenda. Alan and I have 4 basic topics that we're going to discuss here. First one is sort of DLP and what should you expect out of DLP in the first place. Alan and I want to go back and forth a little bit talking about the state of data breaches and how that really kind of applies to DLP. 6 security gaps that you may or may not be really addressing, and how DLP comes into play there, and then how Spector 360, one of our products, can actually help. So, Alan, I guess the first thing here is DLP. What should our audience be expecting with DLP?
Sure, and thanks, Nick. And we're going to talk a little bit about what should you expect with DLP. But before we jump into that, I don't know how many people in our audience are familiar with Spector. You just gave them the company background. But I think, Nick, it's important to say from the outset, we're not DLP, right? What I think Spector talks about is not necessarily DLP. And what I want to emphasize today is how some of the Spector solutions work with DLP or add to what DLP does to give a better level of protection.
Which is a great point, because when people are looking at DLP, we've got up here some flavors of DLP, which I'd love for you to cover. Yeah. I think the point that we're going to be driving home is this webinar is not about saying DLP is a bad thing or anything like that. It's
absolutely
saying we want to make an environment more secure.
But I didn't want to fool anyone by saying, oh, I'm going to learn about DLP today. You are going to learn about DLP, and we're going to learn about some other things as well. So let's talk about flavors of DLP, Nick. And DLP, data leak prevention, data loss prevention, depending who you speak to, has been around now for a number of years. Some people say it is the be-all, end-all. Other people say it's never really lived up to its promise. But certainly it has detractors and supporters. What we've seen in the DLP market over the years, though, is an evolution, Nick. We've seen DLP that comes in different flavors. If you don't like chocolate, there's vanilla, and if you don't like that, there's tutti frutti. The way I break it down, and I don't want to take full credit for this. I was actually schooled in DLP by my friend Rich Mogul at Securosis, who used to cover DLP for Gartner. So a lot of my experience and thoughts come from Rich's original ideas. But, you know, there's what we call full enterprise DLP, Nick, and that is, you see it from companies like Symantec, for instance, and it seeks to cover all the bases. It seeks to be all-encompassing. There's elements that live on servers. There's elements that live on endpoints. There's elements that live at the gateway. Because each of those places represent a potential bottleneck, or where you can bottleneck data being leaked out of the organization. And in a perfect world, if we could all install full enterprise DLP on all of these places, and if the world would just stand still long enough for us to do that, wow, what a great world we would have, and we'd really be doing well with stopping data leak and data loss. However, a funny thing happened on the way to the full enterprise DLP party, in that we just didn't have the money to do all of that. And even when we have the money to do all of that, it's very hard because, as I alluded to earlier, the world doesn't stand still. People are constantly in motion. Our networks are dynamic. Our gateways are changing. There's not just one of them. There's many of them. And you need literally an army of people with a very large budget to implement a full DLP, full enterprise-wide DLP solution. And anyone in our audience who's had experience rolling out some of the bigger DLP solutions like that can probably attest to it. So as a result of that, the market came up with another solution. And again, I'll give credit to Rich Mogul on this. He called it DLP Lite. And that is that, hey, we may not be able to implement this whole DLP solution. We're not going to be able to get it at every gateway. We can't put it on every server. We can't set the attributes for every file. And we certainly can't get it on every endpoint. But we're going to try to do one of them, or two of them, or some of them, but not all of them. And so we get a much lighter flavor of DLP. Good news is it's usually a lot less money. It's a lot easier to set up. The bad news is it's not quite as good. It's not quite as thorough. It's not quite as secure. It doesn't do the job of a full enterprise DLP. But as Donald Rumsfeld said, we go to war with the army we have, not the army we want. And in some cases, DLP Lite is the best we can afford, the best we can do, and it's certainly better than nothing. So you may see a DLP Lite solution just at a gateway, for instance, assuming everyone goes through that gateway, or you hope everyone's going to go through that gateway, or people aren't going to go through that gateway, but at least those who do, you're getting it on there.
Would you say it's more of being able to, let's say, from the blocking standpoint, as an example, blocking one specific medium or that nature?
Well, it's not a medium. It's more about if you had Google Maps and I put, there was 3 routes to the airport, and I put a drunk driving stop on one of those routes. I may catch 1/3 of the drunk drivers. I may catch, maybe all the drunk drivers go on that road. Maybe I'll get them all. Or maybe I'll get none, because the drunk drivers found out I had a stop on that one, and someone on the CB has them rerouted. And that's the problem with DLP Lite. It's somewhat of a half a step, and sometimes the half a step better than none. Well, that's your call to make, right? And it's about managing your own risk. Some people are happy with that. But moving on to the next type of DLP, I call it DLP as a service, DILP as a service, DILP AAS, capital S, because everything is a service today, Nick. We live in a cloud world where especially security is being delivered as a service. And again, this has its genesis in security being hard. Security is too hard for many organizations. Something like DLP is a poster child for that. It can be hard. It can be hard to figure out, what do I stop? When do I alert? What should I stop? What do I look for? All of the dials and bells and whistles that a lot of these good DLPs come with can overwhelm an IT department or even a security department. So in come the managed service experts, managed security service providers. There are specialists who just do DLP. And they seek to come in, Nick, and say, let us do it for you. And we are going to manage it remotely via the cloud. And it sounds great, like so many other SaaS. This is why we use CRM for SaaS, and SaaS has become so popular. It's a SaaS-based DLP. Now, it's not a CapEx because you just pay for it on a monthly basis. So financially, there are some attractions to it. On the other hand, again, the question becomes when you have that third party managing it, how responsive is it in a dynamic environment? And Nick, really that's the third time we've mentioned this dynamic environment in a couple of moments. Today's networks, it's not your grandpa's network anymore. We don't have...
I don't know that Grandpa had a network, but I understand.
Well, my grandpa had a network, but you're right, Nick. But we don't have machines plugged in 24/7 necessarily anymore. I was at RSA a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about vulnerability scanning, and sitting in a group of people. When was the last time your laptop was scanned by a vulnerability scan?
Yeah, it's been quite a while.
Because you're never on when it's on, and and when I go home, I access my network. I may not use my work box. I use my home computer. I may use a tablet. I may use a friend's computer. Well, when you have something that's managed remotely like that, it's very hard to respond to today's dynamic environments.
And that kind of brings up, just kind of adding on to the bit of the slide here. Where is it implemented? For the folks that are listening to us that have an on-prem solution, as a general statement, because obviously you're not talking about any specific vendor, but if you're talking about DLP as a service, is it as equivalent as a DLP Lite? Is it as equivalent to a full enterprise? It depends. Are they,
I think it depends. I think just because you put the AAS, not ASS, but the AAS in front of something doesn't make it better, worse, smarter, or different necessarily.
Sure.
You can get DLP as a service in a DLP Lite sort of way, just as a gateway. You can, if you're willing to pay the money and totally outsource it, you can get someone who comes in and tries to roll out a full managed enterprise-wide DLP
Meaning
solution.
even on your endpoints, on your servers, on your gateway network, everything.
Again, think about the practicality of a living, breathing organization, and this managed service is trying to respond to it remotely. It's a daunting proposition. So with DLP as a service, usually you don't get that full enterprise-wide
Which makes
DLP.
sense.
You're going to get a gateway solution. You may get gateway and servers. But Nick, and we'll talk, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag about what some of the other slides are, but doing just gateway and servers is in a lot of ways just locking the door and leaving your windows open.
Of course, yeah.
So
let's actually talk about what DLP is doing for you, and we can do it in the context of either grouping all three of those flavors together or even breaking them out. It doesn't matter, but we all have a general idea what DLP does. But
sure.
When we talk about what is it doing for our audience here if they're using any of those different types of flavors.
Sure. So Nick, if our audience is looking at the slides. So I don't view this, the alerting and prevention question, if you will. It's sort of a double helix to the type of DLP I'm using.
Mm-hmm.
Each of the different kinds of DLP can also be set for either alerting or preventing. The alerting and prevention issue is an age-old question in security. I first ran into it 15 years ago when we saw the move from intrusion detection to intrusion prevention,
mm-hmm.
right? For a long time, security was all about forensics and analysis and logs and how did they do this, and I'm going to prevent them from doing it next time. And then we sort of got religion, and we said, oh, we're going to be preventive. We're going to be proactive. We're going to stop it before it happens. Sounds great. I bought into it. I drank that Kool-Aid. Funny thing, though, in most customer surveys or customer case studies you do, very few people like to turn on active prevention. There are clear-cut cases, like in the instance of intrusion prevention. Certainly, I'm going to block a code red or a NIMDA virus or something like that. But whether or not I'm going to let this employee have access to copy a file onto a USB stick, there's a lot of shades of gray there for a lot of organizations. And so they struggle. They struggle with clearly defined policies. You can have the greatest technology in the world, Nick, but if you don't have clear-cut policies and process of what's black and what's white, you're going to have an issue here. The technology doesn't help you.
You know, it's interesting you say that when you're talking about the user, the employee, and maybe blocking them from doing something that may or may not be part of their job. I just sat in a room earlier this week with about 30-some-odd CISOs from all kinds of very large organizations. And when asked, did they block, and this is just as an example, something like Dropbox, just one kind of website where data could go out of the organization, very few actually raised their hands. I think it was 5. Yeah, and the rest of them are saying no. And what's interesting that you've been painting a picture sort of in the last 2 slides, but it seems interesting is, do you want to just be alerted that they're using a USB stick, a Dropbox, a social media site, whatever it is, right? Or do you want to stop them from doing it?
And that's the problem, Nick. I mean, I was out at RSA and at the America's Growth Capital Conference, and I heard an endpoint vendor talking about a survey they did where the average user in an organization is touching 34 different cloud services every day. Dropbox, the Boxes of the world, the Facebooks, everything. What should we allow people to connect to? What should we allow people to move files and data back and forth to? Is it just a question of attaching? We're not going to allow file attachments, or are we going to key in 16-digit and 9-digit words? Are we going to monitor that kind of stuff? And then if we're just alerting, what are we doing in terms of the forensics and logging? How much are we logging? Most DLPs, unfortunately, do a lot more about alerting or trying to prevent than they do about actually creating, let's call it, a chain of evidence, right? And that can become real important when you have either criminal investigations or civil liabilities or compliance issues popping up. You need that chain of evidence. And with a DLP, you may not necessarily have that, depending on what you've set for alerting and preventing.
Okay, cool. Let's jump in and talk about the state of data breach. I think you've kind of talked about this a little bit, but the world has changed. I mean, you talked about 15 years ago, IDS to IDS. So let's talk about it a little bit here. What are we looking at today as far as DLP and how effective it can be?
Absolutely. Well, the biggest change, Nick, is even going back to my IDS, IPS analogy. Where do you put it? Where do you put it? Where is the gateway today? Where is, we're sitting here in West Palm Beach at your offices, and it's great. I could just as easily be remotely doing this with you. You have employees who are remotely doing it with you. Our technology, it's not just that the technology has decentralized. Technology has has empowered us to decentralize as organizations, where now you have virtual organizations. I use that term virtual, and that opens a whole nother can of worms. We have virtual servers, and we have virtual networks, and we have virtual desktops. We don't quite have virtual people yet that I know of. But, the whole virtualization has changed the way we need to secure our networks. And this creates challenges. It creates challenges in DLP as well as all of our security challenges. The cloud is another. As I mentioned before, we have users who are touching on average something like 20 to 30 cloud services a day. Every single one of those external cloud services could be a potential point of infection coming in or defection going out, right? Mm-hmm. Data going out the door. But if you speak to managers, they'll tell you that it's imperative that these people, touch these cloud services.
Yeah.
What do we do? I mean, how much of our data is stored on Salesforce.com? how much of our data is stored on a lot of, and Salesforce.com does a great job of security. I'm not knocking them. But how much of our data is not within our direct control? That's the world we live in. It's the truth. You know, it's the reality. It's the facts on the street. Unless you work at Yahoo, you don't have to work at home then, or you don't have to work in the office.
And even that's changing.
And even that's changing, right? At Yahoo, you have to come in. Best Buy now. So, you know, it's created, Nick, as we say here in the slide, this whole shadow IT world, where there exists an IT infrastructure almost outside of the control of the IT department. And how the heck can you have a DLP solution at the gateway and hope that that's going to solve these issues? I mean, it's giving someone a pea shooter and telling them to, you know, take out a tank. It's just, you know, it just doesn't match up.
Yeah, so let's talk about a couple other examples, real-world examples of you know, looking at the state of the data breach. And the first thing would be data theft. Verizon every year puts out their data breach investigations report, and the most recent one being 2012. And just a couple of stats here. They had done one specifically on IP theft, just as an example. And Alan, you know, you and I have both seen this report. It was 46% of IP theft involved insiders. That doesn't mean it was solely an insider. It could have been one with malicious intent, and they're the sole perpetrator, and it could be the fact that they were just an unwitting participant. Mm-hmm. But I think we did even see that, what was it, only 86% were involved outsiders,
well, right.
So there's a solid 14%
that were totally inside. So interesting things about that, Nick. 87% were involved outsiders, 46% involved insiders. Obviously, that's more than 100%. That means 13 or 14% was strictly insiders, but another probably 50%, or slightly less than 50%, involved a combination of inside and outside coming in here.
Too. So they're definitely part of the mix here. There was some stats on who was involved, and we got a couple departments that are up here. Everything from an upper executive down to a regular employee. You can see the departments that have access to either person identifiable information or you know, financials that are going to, you know, have a significant financial impact on the person perpetrating the data theft and so on. But the staggering details here are actually in the time frames that are involved. The time frames for the breaches, well, actually, let me put it this way. They went and defined breaches and the amount of time it takes to detect a breach in increments of seconds, minutes, hours, you know, days, weeks, months, and years. And so 77% you can see here are in seconds to hours, and you've given a good example earlier, just like a USB stick, someone copying a file. It takes literally, you know, a second or so. But discovery of it, in 48% of the time, took months to years.
Yeah. I mean, let me comment on this a little bit, Nick. First of all, I think according to the Verizon data breach, the average breach was discovered by a third party.
Yes, that's always usually the case. Yeah.
And the average breach wasn't discovered for as long as 18 months.
Yeah, which also coincides with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners fraud report.
Right.
Their median time frame is 18 months.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. There was just a story. This is fraud and not data theft, but a woman writing like $400,000 worth of checks over 7 years.
Yeah, I saw that one.
And the only reason she got caught was she wrote a check, and the bank teller said, "You're not the person whose name's on the check."
But yet, all the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nick, something else, that when Marcus first introduced us, he used the term trusted insiders.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember when we used that term, but there are no trusted insiders today, Nick. When you have, you know, 6% of executive and upper management were involved in data breach, 29% in the finance and accounting department. If those aren't your trusted insiders, who are?
Yeah.
I mean, so we don't have trusted insiders anymore. I don't think anyone is beyond reproach at this point. It's something we need to keep in mind.
So let's hone in a little bit on maybe where some of these breaches take place. Here's an example of compliance breaches. This is where, you know, information like people's social security information, that kind of thing is all being taken out.
Personally identifiable
and so
information.
I went and actually pulled the 2012 HIPAA breaches and started categorizing them, and you can see half of the time it's involving theft, and there could be some overlap here, of course. 22% was unauthorized access, and then 14% was lost. But the most interesting stat that's not on here, but I'm going to put up here real quick, is that 2/3 of the time it was related to their computer.
Yeah.
So, when you're talking about where DLP needs to be blocking and or alerting, and preventing and alerting, it kind of becomes very clear to me when I look at this kind of stat that it's definitely going to be the endpoint. It needs to be, whether or not they, whether or not that they are actually accessing. It could be printing something out. It could be putting something on a USB stick. It could be, whatever the case is. That's the main focal point.
Again, you know what, Nick? It's the endpoint, but never underestimate the person behind the endpoint, right? These endpoints, we run into this not only in HIPAA, but in PCI as well. We're so focused on credit card data and cardholder environments in an electronic format, and sometimes we lose sight of just how easy it is to take it. What is it? The law of the dynamic. My kids learned this in school. Energy can change one form or another, but you'd never lose the energy. It just
one of our listeners is going to pop it up here in the questions field in a second if you can't remember it, because I can't remember it either. But I know what you're talking about.
It's the law of dynamic, whatever it is. But information can be taken from an electronic format to analog format really easily. And again, DLP solutions, they're made to stop electronic transfer. They don't really necessarily do a great job when we're talking about analog stuff.
Now that's a totally different issue that becomes very cumbersome. Let's take a look at a couple of the digital threats that you may or may not have addressed that DLP can hopefully take some addressing or address some of that. So the first one here that I've got is just plain old USB. It's the lowest hanging fruit. I'm not trying to actually imply here that our listeners haven't address USB entirely, but it's possible that you haven't, and it's the lowest hanging fruit. You made a point, though, that some people might still need access and some people might not. Is the granularity there with DLP?
Sometimes. To be honest with you, sometimes. The question is, again, how do I tell someone who really needs access and who doesn't? I mean, if I can make that determination, and again, I think that's more of a policy process determination than a technology issue.
Sure.
I can make the technology work for me sometimes. But the bottom line there is, USB represents not only a tremendous vector out of information out, but information in.
Yeah.
There are a lot of organizations, back when I was doing work in the DOD, they just shut down. They just shut down all USB.
Which isn't entirely a bad idea for, I think most organizations, the employees don't need it. They might because I need to copy something because I'm going to go somewhere, but it's a real tough call.
You know what, I hate using USB sticks, but I find myself forced to, Nick, and I don't think I'm...
No, you're not alone.
No.
So the next one is going to be printers. Now, I put this up here because it's one of those threats that people aren't addressing. There's some basic forms of auditing, like in the Windows space, where I can audit who's printed, but I don't actually know what they printed. I know who printed it. There's some metadata on the printer sometimes, maybe you can, but it's not a complete view. And so if organizations are really saying, I don't want this data, whatever this data happens to be, ever to leave the organization inappropriately, it's almost like, this is, I'm sort of saying it tongue-in-cheek, but sort of saying it seriously, you have to get rid of all your printers.
Well, Nick, so this is sort of that digital to analog divide right there, right? Because once it's printed on paper, it's no longer digital. The question, so I'm not going to be able to stop that, but can I stop it from being printed? And again, policy and process over who can print what. Now, is there technology where I can designate certain files as unprintable? I've seen solutions that can do that.
Yeah, rights management can help with some of that as well.
Absolutely. Sure. What a pain it is. I mean, undertake that on an organization-wide basis and say, this document, yeah, for this guy, this document, no, for that guy. And again, it gets into this whole prevention versus alerting versus just logging.
Yeah.
And
who's going to read those logs, by the way?
And it's a nightmare.
It is.
A nightmare.
Yeah. The next one is wireless and Bluetooth. Now, the reason why I bring this up is it's one thing to connect your wireless at the office, but the moment I let you go, let's say, home with your laptop and connect to a different wireless network, I don't know where you're taking the data. The same thing with Bluetooth. I did a test a couple of years back, and it's kind of a simple one, but I happened to be working in a two-story building, and I had a phone down in the car, and I connected my laptop to the phone. I transferred a file over to the phone that represented like a bunch of customer records or something, and then disconnected it. And there was never a record that had ever happened. It just the data was taken out of the organization, and I didn't even have to carry it out of the building. I just copied it down to a phone that was outside the office.
And phones are really portable. But even one better, Nick, I'm sitting here at your desk. I fired up my laptop earlier. I took a look at what wireless networks were available, and though I didn't log on, there were a dozen networks there, some of them unprotected, by the way, because we're in a 15-story office building. Yeah. So I saw a dozen networks. I could have easily logged on to one of them, come back in, and you don't know I'm here necessarily. So it could happen. It could happen with wireless Bluetooth. It's ubiquitous. So it's scary.
Yeah, so it's one thing to even lock them down here, but then what if a person needs to go home and get on the internet to get their job done if they're doing after-hours work? It's kind of tough to lock them down. It becomes one of those other troublesome spots.
So we've just come through a terrible recession, Nick, where companies squeezed more efficiency out of less workers. Well, one of the ways they did that is we've kind of done away with the 9 to 5.
It doesn't really exist, yeah.
There's no more 9 to 5 people. I don't know how many people out on our audience work 9 to 5. We all work from home. We all check email. These phones and devices and laptops, they tether us to our jobs. As much as they empower us, they tether us to our jobs.
The division is somewhat gone. It's a very blended life now.
And so, it's very hard to tell someone you don't need to be accessing corporate email after hours. Not when I want to squeeze every last efficiency out of you. So it's a no-win situation.
Yeah, it can be. All right. So the next one is just webmail, and the reason why I've got webmail there is twofold. One, it represents a medium by which data can go out of the organization. But two, the other thing that becomes very troublesome, if you take, let's say, you set up a Gmail session, it's SSL encrypted. So unless you've got like an SSL proxy or something in place, I don't know what you're doing, generally speaking, what's going across that wire, except for maybe I know there's a lot of data, but I'm not sure, are you pulling something down or are you pushing something out?
And I don't know how you set up SSL proxies with Gmail.
I don't know that it's possible either, but I mean in general, if I did anything, and it's one thing to say, well, I'll block Gmail. Okay, I can go to GoDaddy instead of zyqlzz79.com and buy a webmail account with it for $2 a month, and now I've got my own webmail address that you don't know that I even have as a domain, and out I go.
Now, there's another element to it as well, and it's that trusted insider again. Let's say, Nick, I do trust you. You're not going to do that, but you store all your webmail, but you don't choose Gmail. You chose Joe's webmail service.
Sure, whatever it is.
And you're storing files up there, and then Joe's get broken. How many people use Evernote? We're using Evernote to take notes from corporate meetings and everything, and they just got an email last week to go check change your password. So, again, you need to make policies about what can I allow off my network.
That's good stuff.
Because once it's off your network, assume it's out of your control.
That's a great point. So the next one here is cloud sharing. You brought up Evernote. That's a great point. Dropbox as well.
They've had their share of security issues
they have. And actually they've gotten better. Dropbox actually has implemented a number of feature sets that are very specific to organizations that want to manage that. Mm-hmm. So the idea with the cloud sharing, of course, is I have no visibility into who's got it. I mean, there's a company, Cloudability, who did a survey of their customers. They do management of cloud accounts and whatnot, and it was a staggering number had like 4 or more. I think it was like 2/3 or maybe even a half. It had a large number of accounts that are all cloud-based, and there's no control. Again, Dropbox even, it's SSL encrypted. I don't know what's being copied.
But Nick, Dropbox is one of the reputable ones. Over the last week, I've run into 4 or 5, not that they're less reputable, but I've run into 4 or 5 others you probably never heard of.
Yeah.
That are offering file sharing services like this that may not even be encrypted, that may not even be storing encrypted, that may not have put the time and effort into the security. It's
a great point. That actually leads to my last one here, which is social media. And let me define social media real quick. I'm not just talking about like a Facebook where I can go and post, I hate my company, or, you work for a hospital and you say, hey, look, Snoop Dogg just came in the hospital. He suddenly developed, I'm doing air quotes, folks, glaucoma. So, that kind of, but it could be any kind of website that is used to share information. And I'm going to use a real world example. Some of you may have heard of the website PhotoBucket.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with PhotoBucket, by the way. This isn't about them being bad or good. I went and did a test that I just wondered if I could do this. So I took an Excel spreadsheet and I put some data in it. I renamed the extension of the file to JPEG to make it a graphics file. I uploaded it to PhotoBucket. I went to a different machine. I downloaded the file. I renamed it back to an Excel spreadsheet, and guess what? Opens up perfectly.
Absolutely. You
So,
just made your own cloud sharing.
Yes, and I just stole data out of a company using a medium that would never think to ever block because it's stupid pictures. Who cares?
And now here's the thing. Most DLPs, you tell it to filter on certain file types. You may not put JPEGs. You might put XLS, but not JPEG. And there's your DLP, with a big fat hole in it.
Yeah, and so that actually brings up the point that you actually even mentioned earlier. There's more and more out of the control, and there's many ways that that dynamic environment where users are trying to work around what's there. Maybe in some cases malicious. In other cases, it's just because IT is sort of slowed down, and so they have to I got to find my own way to share files. So, the shadow IT environment. And so that's kind of where SpectorSoft tries to come in, and we come in with what we call user activity monitoring. And user activity monitoring is basically the ability to have a view into all of the activity of an employee by literally, think of it this way, putting an agent on their Windows or their Mac machines and actually viewing everything that they do and recording it. And it actually works kind of in three parts. The first one is recording everything they do, and that would be every keystroke, every application, every email, webmail, of course, as well. Everything with files are copied, and the list goes on, and recording it. And that way, the second part is alerting you to those actions, and then that way, it's not just I'm going to record a whole bunch of stuff, and it's just like another log or another kind of big data to go through. Instead, being alerted based on keywords and activity, so that I know when someone might be doing something wrong. You talked about maybe someone copying to a USB stick, and I brought up Dropbox, or someone is
other social media.
Yeah, other social media. Someone even on maybe downloading a file off of Salesforce because they've got an ability to export out, or whatever the case is. And then the third step is the ability to review that data in aggregate and actually replay those actions and see what the employee was doing. You can literally think of it as if you have putting a video camera behind an employee's desk from the moment they sit down to the moment they get up. And the idea is DLP is going to block the things that you know about, and then user activity monitoring is there as a means to identify what they are doing, and then identify some of those, you used the word holes just a second ago, holes in the DLP implementation to further make it stronger.
Absolutely. And Nick, I just quickly wanted to mention, I saw a comment from one of the listeners. I used the term chain of evidence instead of chain of custody. In talking about preserving an evidence or to review what happened, my law school professors would be ashamed of me. But, and I apologize, but it is, chain of custody of the evidence, actually.
No,
so
sure. And the interesting thing here is, on that same topic, is user activity monitoring allows a lot more custody there of that evidence.
Well, I don't know your product like you do, Nick, so I apologize. But from what I've seen of it and what you've told me, it's tailor-made for that. If you're doing any kind of investigation, whether it be criminal, civil, compliance-related, I mean, the kinds of the ability to actually be able to replay a video of what the guy does.
It's really strong. Yeah, and it's
you don't get better evidence.
Yeah. And the benefit here to the DLP user, I should say really more the DLP administrator, the folks on the call here listening to us, is that it's going to allow you visibility into the employee's activities so you can figure out how to make DLP stronger. And then at the same time, to your point, Alan, if you need to do an investigation or something, it's possible. How it differs from other solutions is it's always in the right place at the right time. DLP attempts to, and that's not a bad thing against DLP, but it's only as good as what you have plugged. In this case, we're always watching the employee, so if you have Dropbox blocked, they decide to use box.net, you would miss it with DLP per se, and just in sort of a very generic example. But we're not going to miss it with user activity monitoring because we're always watching what the employee is doing. Second one is the activities are always in context. We're aggregating all those actions, and we can see before, during, and after a specific event if they did copy something on the USB stick, why. Well, they got an email from their boss that said, please copy something and bring it to my office because I'm going to need it. Fine. Or they just send an email on their webmail account to a buddy there saying, I'm going to get the customer accounts and I'll have it for you in the morning. That's totally different. Everything's in context.
So, Nick, you just hit the word context. I think that's something that sometimes is lacking in our DLP solutions, context.
Yeah, and that's really where the user activity monitoring strength is. And then the last part here is that it's anytime, anywhere, in any medium. It doesn't matter if it's a USB stick or if they're on the web or they're copying from one application to another and they're cutting and pasting. It makes no difference. It's watching everything they do, so you can't really miss anything.
Sure.
And then the last part here is that it allows the appropriate amount of action to be taken up to and including having to be used in a court of law. So it does.
Back to our chain of custody.
Yes, chain of custody, chain of evidence. Yes, you can make up terms. It's okay. So let me tell you a little bit about how it works, just in 3 easy steps. The record, alert, and review I covered earlier. This will just take like 2 or 3 minutes. I can't do a live demo with this particular interface. I'm doing this kind of in a screenshot kind of presentation methodology. Spector 360 records all of those aspects you see on the left-hand side, just basically takes everything an employee does and breaks it into easy-to-understand categories. So you see chat and IM and web sites, email, files transferred, keystrokes typed, and so on. And at the top is the screen snapshots, and that's what creates what we call a visual record of what they did, because the picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, if I can have 1,000 pictures, that's even better. And so what happens there is we give you the ability to record everything from 1-bit monochrome to 32-bit color. And then in this screenshot here at the very bottom, you can see how, as a fallback position, I'll take a screen snapshot every 30 seconds. But that's a fallback position. You really don't want a screenshot every 30 seconds. A lot can happen. So instead, if you look at the top part of that particular window, there are certain actions that occur, like let's say a program gets loaded or the title changes in the window, or they hit the left mouse button or the right mouse button. Or in the center there, you can specify specific keystrokes, like a control or delete, maybe if they're doing a control-C and control-V, that kind of thing. And I can take screen snapshots when it matters. I tie that with the ability to alert. And with Spector 360, you have the ability to use these keyword alerts to notify you when somebody does something bad. Now, the keyword could be the name of a project. It could be a folder path. It could be a word like resume or monster if you're worried about someone getting a job. It could be just about anything. And you see below those keywords a listing of types of events that would occur, like it would scan keystrokes or a web page or an application or whatever the case is. And then kind of coming back to the screen snapshot storyline at the very bottom, because this is a very specific event that you've deemed is bad, that you want to find out more about what's going on, you can trigger a far more rigorous type of screen snapshot prescription, if you will, where I might say, I want a screen snapshot every 1 second for the next 2 minutes, or whatever is deemed appropriate.
You know what, Nick? So again, I don't know the product as you do, but looking at this and hearing you talk about it, the flexibility, right, of what you can do is you're so far out of, I mean, with other solutions, and I'm not bad-mouthing DLP. DLP has a place.
Oh, it definitely does.
But it knows what you know, you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
And a dangerous person is someone who knows what he doesn't know or doesn't know what he knows.
No, he knows what you don't know.
Right, exactly. But my chain of custody guy is going to be really upset with me. But, this kind of flexibility, Nick, allows you to adapt to the dynamic environments we have to work with.
And that's the point. And that's really what we're trying to get at, is monitoring what they're doing in order to adapt appropriately.
Agreed.
And having this level of context, and I'm just focusing on the screen snapshots because they do provide a lot of visibility into exactly how did somebody do it. Did they go through an anonymous proxy in order to get to a site that then they copied file, or whatever it is, right? But that's where the value is, so that you can clearly get some evidence. Not so much you're going to go after somebody for doing it, but certainly you can make DLP even stronger. Those are this first kind here is all client-side sort of real-time, if you will, alerting. The second type is a server-side alerting that is done with a far more granular level of, what's the word I want to use? I guess kind of as it searches through the activities, I guess the best way to do is just to show you an example of somebody printing a lot of documents. You can see if you look through these lines in the table, it says the count of events is greater than 5, and the activity contains print, or the device type contains printer. And this is to make sure that either you're doing a print activity within an application, or you're just simply utilizing the printer device. But the intent here is that the server-side alerting is there in case, let's say, someone hits print screen inside of an application. It's a very, very specific need, but that alerts you to the fact that it's happening. So if you're wondering, how are people getting around, maybe you don't know, and now you're guessing. Well, I'd like to know, so anytime this happens, because they could get around it if they're going to try it, let me go ahead and I'll figure out a way to block it.
Yeah.
So it's very powerful stuff.
Absolutely. But the power is in the granularity, Nick. I mean, and the flexibility.
Yeah, this is all looking at every action that an employee could take within a program, and giving the ability to say, let me tell you when they do some very, very specific activities. The next part is reviewing the data, and the data is seen in a dashboard, and we have a number of ways to look at the data. It's all aggregated. You can use, if you look at the very left-hand side, lower left there, you'll see a user explorer where I can do on a per-user basis. You'll see where I have a data explorer where I can go and search through the individual data. I have even just an overall search capability. Look up a keyword. But let me run through just one example here of how the product works.
Nick,
I want to make sure
while you're keying that up, and I know time is
running we've got a couple minutes before we can answer some questions.
What I think we need to emphasize, this is a multi-user dashboard we're looking at, not just saying.
No, it's across the board. If you had 100 employees, you'd have all 100 employees listed in here.
Because that's, I mean, from my point of view, I'm consulting with companies every day who are looking for organizational, not single-user kind of solutions. And so having a dashboard for each user, I don't have enough hair on I don't have much hair on my head to begin with, but, you know, it would be impossible. This, to me, is where the rubber meets the road, right, where I can manage that.
It certainly helps. So the example here I'll give you is in the upper left-hand corner. There's users transferring files to a removable drive. One of the benefits of having aggregated data is I have points of reference too. You can see that one user at the bottom there in light blue of the upper left slide has very little data being copied, but that guy in green, he's doing a lot. If I was to click on that, that would bring up this detail here where I can see through this table here confidential customer lists over and over and over again being copied from an F drive to a USB stick.
Wow.
I can then go right-click any one of those events, and you see one of the options there selected as event snapshot, and I can then actually play through a visual record of what the person's doing, again, before, during, and afterwards. You can see some context. I see after they copy the data, they went to a Yahoo Mail account, and they have this email they're sending out called Employee Records, and attached, please find the employee records you asked for, and then I can see that they've attached those documents, right? So
outrageous.
And this is where you get the context, you actually have a problem and you need to do an additional step somewhere in your DLP solution. So there's, and the idea is that overall you're getting this benefit, again, of aggregated data, aggregated for applications, who's using the certain application the most, who's using Facebook the most, who's transferring the most data, who's printing the most documents, you name it, that's all in there. So I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, so let me go ahead and just kind of quickly sum this up. So kind of in summary here, I think that we've both kind of made the case here that DLP is part of a security solution. Certainly the user activity monitoring with Spector 360 is not the answer in and of itself.
In and of itself.
No, it's not.
So, Nick, let me just really quickly emphasize that. A common theme I heard at RSA this year, and I've been saying it for years, there are no magic silver bullets in security, right? And it takes a village. DLP is part of that equation. User activity monitoring, such as Spector 360, is another part of that equation. But no one should get the impression that if I buy this thing, I'm somehow immune from data breach, or I've done my job.
No, good point. The second part, in fact, here, the breaches are going to demonstrate that gaps exist. It's just going to make your DLP stronger, as the case might be. UAM's job is just to provide the visibility into what the employees are doing, and it's going to make DLP have a better implementation.
Yeah. So again, my interpretation of this, Nick, is it makes your DLP better. It reinforces DLP. It covers some gaps in DLP. But in all honesty, as an outsider, I think you do your company and product a disservice by even giving the impression that it works solely with DLP. I'm sure plenty of people who use this without a DLP.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It doesn't need DLP. It's just simply the presumption here is that the way that we've formulated this webinar, we're presuming the audience has a DLP solution. If they don't, this certainly works without it. So I've got some resources up here on a resource slide. I'm going to leave this slide up here. One is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that we referenced. And then Spector 360, there's a couple bit.ly links there for an evaluation as well as an online test drive where you can kind of play with the product inside of a web browser. I'm going to leave that up while we answer some questions here. Sure. You've already answered the one where Bill says there's no such thing as a chain of evidence. It's a chain of custody. So we got that one.
I apologize, Bill.
Yeah, you got that one covered. William asked, can I get a copy of the presentation? William, I believe that SC Magazine makes this available afterwards. If for some reason you don't get a copy, if you'd email sales@spectorsoft.com and tell them to forward it to Nick, that's me, N-I-C-K, I'll be sure to get you a copy of the presentation. Deepak asks, will user activity monitoring violate privacy laws? And the answer is, it depends.
The answer is, it depends. Well, the first answer is, Nick, as an attorney, law school graduate, I'm not
sort of. I think you've lost that credibility at this point with the chain of custody. But go on anyways. Go on, Mr. Attorney Guy.
No, we're not giving legal advice, and you should always seek out your own legal advice from paid counsel. But that being said,
sure,
it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But overall, Nick, and I'm sure there's a problem you've dealt with, but I've actually had some experience with these issues. Privacy laws of who? If it's company-owned data, has the employee signed an agreement? Whose data is it?
Yeah, all good points.
These are all questions and variables. Overall, in the U.S., as far as I know, it really doesn't violate.
There's not an employee privacy law with the exception of some of the findings around the Facebook. We want your Facebook passwords and stuff. But
yeah, Nick, 15 years from now, when we talk about my grandpa's network, I don't know if they're going to have a concept of privacy for electronics.
Well, that's interesting. So the interesting thing here is what we found in the U.S. If I look at all the news stories and the cases that in the courts that have been happening recently, it's an issue of an expectation of privacy more than, do I have a right to privacy? There's no right to privacy in the U.S., but there are reasonable expectations of privacy. So typically what we find is you're going to need to have an acceptable use policy and so on. But you made an earlier note that I'll just reemphasize. We're not giving legal advice.
Right.
You want to seek your own counsel and so on. So hopefully that answered that question, Deepak.
But I would just mention, though, the fact that you guys have been in business as long as you have with this, and I assume you haven't had your pantsuit off. Speak volumes.
Yeah, I'm still wearing pants, yes.
Okay.
Another question comes in, how are the recorded logs? I'm assuming this is about Spector 360. Accessed by the admin, is it email or a network share? It's used through a dashboard. That was that earlier graphic that I showed you. I could actually go a couple slides back here real quick so you can see it. Sorry, I have to go step by step here, but that's the dashboard. That can be installed separately.
So, and the dashboard, Nick, is an application or a web app?
It's just an application. It's an on-prem application.
I'd love to see a follow-up from that person. I'm thinking, he may be thinking, can I export those logs into a SIM or something
So that's a good question. Spector 360 does have the ability, on a limited fashion, to export out the data in case somebody wants to put it in a SIM as another data source. So that's certainly feasible.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So then, is there a chance the activity monitoring element could be detected via local scan, AV, anti-malware, et cetera, by the user? So what we do is we are whitelisted through a number of vendors. Most of them. There's a couple that are kind of sticky, like McAfee and Microsoft. So what we do is when this gets implemented, we install everything into one folder, so that makes it easy for you just to make an exclusion, and that way it doesn't get detected. And that's the short answer.
I think, is he asking about detection or blocking?
He says detected via local scan, so I assume
so I
by
think
antivirus.
It would be detected. We're not a virus looking to evade.
No, but because it does run in stealth or can run in stealth,
right.
That's why, and so an exclusion usually is necessary.
Yeah, an exclusion unless you're whitelisted already.
Yeah.
But the fact that the AV picked it up and you need to exclude it means that they do in fact detect it. It's not invisible as that. Not trying to evade anything.
All right. So then somebody else asked about how you manage BYOD for this. So in our case, BYOD, we don't have a great application there, and the reason for that is I don't know an employee on the planet that's going to allow their employer to put a piece of software on their own personal device that monitors everything they do. So this is not for BYOD. It would probably be more appropriate for like a company-owned, personally enabled type of environment where, again, this runs on Mac and Windows machines. Right. It has a limited scope with BlackBerry devices, but would allow someone to go ahead and do that. But it certainly wouldn't play in a BYOD.
So Nick, the BYOD and ownership of those devices, again, seek your own legal counsel, but that's a whole different, honestly, a whole different ball of wax there, right? It's
Yes.
different parameters.
Yeah. So Joe actually piped in here to help the rest of you out about the slides. He said slides are available under event resources as a PDF file. Thank you, Joe. Much appreciated.
But it's so much is that I'm a former Gartner. Let me make it clear, I'm not a former Gartner security guy.
You were talking about
Rich Mogul.
Rich Mogul, the former security guy, right?
But like most of the people on here, I paid my money to Gartner as well to get their advice.
No,
consult.
Fair enough. So a couple other questions here. My DLP solution already alerts me, so how is this different? And that's a great question. This is alerting you to employee activity, saying that John went ahead and either performed an action like the one I showed you, which was the user printing more than 5 times in a short period of time, that kind of thing, or it's something along the lines of a user went into an application, triggered a keyword, whatever the case is.
I think the important thing, Nick, having seen your demo here and what little I know about the product, is the question of context. Back to my IDS analogy, just to desensitize security admins because we alerted the heck out of them. They were getting alerts every 3 seconds until they shut the alerts off. But so alerts without context quickly lose meaning, and they just serve to desensitize people. And that happens with DLP as well, right? We get alerts, and I'm not saying they're false positives or false negatives, but they certainly desensitize. Context is a big piece of that.
Yeah, which I think actually helps answer kind of the next question, which is probably going to be our last question today, I think. We're at 2:58. Yeah, it says, if I already blocked Dropbox, etc., how is user activity monitoring going to help? And that's a good question. And that the answer here is that it's going to provide, like you just mentioned, context. It's one thing to block Dropbox, but then are people using Google Drive, or are they using Box.net,
or Copy, or SkyDrive, or Drupal, or
there's a billion trillion of them. Yeah.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, and so in that same example applies kind of if we expand the context of the question to say, I'm blocking this one thing that we know is a threat, and what about all the other things? It's going to provide you context into whether or not they're using it.
Trying to block things is like playing whack-a-mole, right? It's just good until the next one pops up.
Yeah. And in some ways, even let's say from a non-security aspect, where let's say someone's using Facebook too much. If you block Facebook, they may just end up using their cell phone instead, and you've just simply changed devices to something that you don't know what they're doing. And so in some ways, we find that it might even be better to allow someone to act naturally as they would, so you can root them out. UAM certainly is not a prevention solution. That's what DLP is for. This is a detection and protection type solution.
This is more of an alerting and that. And when we say root them out, Nick, I don't mean go pull them out of their, and throw them out. It's maybe we just tell them, hey, we're aware you're doing this. Do you know you're doing something against company policy?
Good point.
And we educate them.
Yeah. So I think we're up at the hour, out of time. No, it's quite all right. This has been good stuff. So I hope this has been educational. Hope it's been informative to the readership. We really thank you, Alan. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Nick. Thank SC Magazine for having me. It's always a pleasure to do these.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance today.
Have a great day.
All right, unfortunately, that's all the time we have, folks. So just a reminder that this webcast will be available on demand later today on scmagazine.com in our events section. Many thanks to Nick and Alan for being with us today and sharing all that great insight. And, of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in.